Welcome back to another episode of That Diabetes Guy. My name is Nick, and I have a special treat for you today. I interviewed a dietitian who's going to talk about healthy eating, in particular with managing diabetes. So we're going to talk about a lot of different things from carbs, balancing meals, different types of diet plans, to cultural preferences, to picky eaters and sharing healthy recipes. So a lot of things to cover. If you guys like what you see and enjoy seeing the experts, consider subscribing, maybe liking or commenting. I really would appreciate that. And for those who already have, thank you very much. So stay tuned and enjoy.
Hi, I'm Dawn No. I'm a registered dietitian and certified diabetes care and education specialist. I have been helping people with diabetes for the last 15 years learn how to live well and thrive.
So having you on, you're my first guest appearance, so congratulations.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
My first expert, and we need to talk a little bit about nutrition, and I think carbohydrates is always a hot topic, so I think that's a good starting point. But why should anybody with diabetes be concerned about carbs?
So everyone who has diabetes needs to know about carbohydrate foods because these are the foods that directly make blood sugars go up. These foods would be foods such as breads, pastas, rice, cereal, starchy vegetables such as potatoes, sweet potatoes, peas, and corn.
So all my favorites.
Yes.
So what are other foods that I could eat that don't have any carbs?
That is actually my favorite question because what tends to happen with learning about diabetes and nutrition is that people always focus on carbohydrate foods, but really what I like to teach people right away are the foods that don't make their blood sugars go up. These are foods that you could be eating all the time in between meals. I like to make sure these foods are added to meals. So these would be foods like proteins, such as meats, beef, chicken, fish, eggs, cheese, nuts, and nut butters like peanut butter or cashew butter or almond butter, as well as cottage cheese. And then fats are also foods that don't raise the blood sugar. So that would be things like olive oil, butter, again, nuts, avocados, and then vegetables. And those are all of the vegetables that you can probably think of. So things like broccoli, cauliflower, tomatoes, salad, carrots, onions, I could go on, zucchini. And those foods have a very tiny amount of carbohydrate in them, but all of that carbohydrate is fiber. So they really don't raise blood sugar very much.
Is there an easy way to tell if it's a carb-free item?
So sure, if you happen to have a food label, you can always look at how many carbohydrates are in a food by looking at the food label, and we can look at that as well. Some foods are a little trickier because they don't have food labels. So often your foods that are not processed, which are foods that we want people to eat, like all of those vegetables that I just mentioned, they don't really come with a food label. So it might be helpful to have a list of foods that are carbs and foods that are not carbs so that you know which foods you could easily eat without having blood sugars go up. So I will provide a link in the description with quality carbs, so foods that are carbs but might be ones that you might choose to include in moderation, as well as foods that are not carbs, such as those proteins, vegetables, and fats.
Are there carb limits for people with diabetes?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So the amount of carbohydrate that someone with diabetes chooses to eat very much can depend on their preference and how they want to manage their diabetes, as well as what medications they may be taking. Certain medications can cause low blood sugars, and so in that case, it's really important that that person either eats enough carbohydrate to match those medications, or they talk with their doctor or diabetes care team to discuss how they want to treat their diabetes with their medications and their nutrition plan. What is interesting is that classically people with diabetes are often told that they have to eat 60 grams of carbs at each meal. And what I like to share with my patients and clients is that this is not necessarily the case. And if you really dig into the history of this number, the 60 grams of carbohydrates, it came from a calculation of people calculating that someone with diabetes might need approximately 1,500 to maybe 1,800 calories per day. And they took that calorie number and they said, okay, well, we think that 50% of the carbohydrate should come from, or 50% of the calories should come from carbohydrate foods. And when you calculate that up, that is approximately 60 grams of carb for each meal or 3 meals a day. And what's really interesting is there's really no research to back up this number that 60 grams of carbohydrate is required for people with diabetes. So for some people, 60 grams of carbohydrate is much less than they might used to be eating. For example, if you go to Subway and you get a 12-inch sub, that's about 90 grams of carbohydrate in one sitting. So for some people, 60 grams of carbohydrate might be less than they're used to eating, and for others it might be way too much. And one way to evaluate this is to check blood sugars after meals to see what I like to call your carb tolerance is, to see how well you do with a certain amount of carbohydrate. So I encourage people to be detectives when it comes to learning about how much food they may choose to eat from a carbohydrate perspective.
Is there really such thing as a good carb and a bad carb?
Oh, that's probably one of my favorite questions. I really have learned over the years that I work very hard not to use the words good and bad in relation to food and nutrition. We tend to beat ourselves up enough, and there's no reason to assign ourselves to be good or bad people because of the type of foods that we eat. So instead of using the words good, I like to talk about quality carbs. Quality carbs are carbs that have some great nutrition in them. So we can talk about what they can do for you and your body and when it might be appropriate to eat those quality carbs. Quality carbs might be things like high fiber whole grains or fruits such as berries. Also could be sweet potatoes or steel cut oats or oats in general.
Should I limit how many low carb items I eat in a day?
Tell me more about that question.
Is there a limit to how many peanuts I can eat in one sitting?
Oh, okay. Well, that's a great question. So can you eat as many peanuts as you want? Well, maybe. It depends on what your overall health goals are. If you do need to know that peanuts have protein and fat, so therefore they do have, because of the fat, they're a little higher calorie item. So if you are watching your weight, you may need to limit how many peanuts you have. But if you are very comfortable with your weight and you want to eat a snack that doesn't raise your blood sugar, I'd say go for it with the peanuts.
So I don't want to say bad carbs, but we'll say low quality carbs. Could you consider Chinese food low quality?
Well, it depends on what kind of Chinese food we're talking about.
So if I got General Tso's Chinese and fried rice with an egg roll, is that something I could include in my diet?
Well, you always have the choice to include foods that you want. So I think that's really important that we talk about the healthiest option or the most quality option versus another option. So I think you have a great question of specifically the General Tso's chicken. What's maybe not so healthy about the General Tso's chicken is that it is a fried food, so it's breaded and fried. That breading, it's important to know that that could raise blood sugar. And then there is typically a sauce on the General Tso's chicken, and what is a little sneaky with Chinese food is that the sauces tend to have cornstarch and in some cases sugar in them. So Chinese food is one of those that that might surprise you with how quickly it can raise blood sugar because of what I like to call those hidden carbs in the breading and in the sauces. The rice absolutely will raise the blood sugar. So that's one that if you were to alter your favorite Chinese meal of General Tso's chicken, I might consider adding a little bit more vegetable to it and a little bit less of the rice to see if we could minimize the impact of the carbohydrate in this particular meal.
So does everyone with diabetes have to count carbs?
Actually, no. There are so many ways that you can eat with diabetes that do not necessarily involve carb counting. And I think it's really important that people know this, that for type 2 diabetes, they've studied 8 different eating patterns are recognized by the American Diabetes Association, including the Mediterranean diet, as well as low-fat eating patterns or low-carb eating patterns, vegetarian. So there's lots of ways to eat with diabetes that do not actually involve carbohydrate counting. One of the most common ways of doing that is called the plate method. And so the plate method is filling half of a 9-inch plate with vegetables. And again, these are the foods that don't raise carbohydrates, like green beans or carrots or broccoli or cauliflower, as well as a quarter of your plate with a meat or a protein food. And then depending on the type of diabetes you have and what type of diabetes medications you have, you could fill the other quarter with a quality carbohydrate. Now, I probably would not add pasta to this meal. I did not design this particular plate. I might add a whole grain or a piece of fruit. So if you did a piece of fruit here, this would be the carbohydrate portion of the meal, or maybe even just a slice of whole grain bread as an easy way to add a very simple carbohydrate. It may be that you choose not to add a carbohydrate food at all, and this could be okay as long as we make sure that the medications you're on don't require you to need carbohydrates at meals, because we don't want blood sugar to go too low. But these foods, the protein, the vegetables, do not raise blood sugar. So you'd be having just a small amount of food that does raise blood sugar, and you can do that all without having to count carbohydrates.
How would someone work around cultural preferences? Let's just say there's a lot of rice or breads or pastas that are generally in their diet, and how would you approach someone to tackle those barriers if you're finding that it's just a abundance of carbs in their intake?
Taking someone's cultural preferences into consideration is hugely important. So when we talk about eating and nutrition for people with diabetes, or really just anybody, we have to incorporate family and culture and food preferences, because if we're looking at making even especially health changes, they need to be sustainable. And so we need to think about what is traditional in someone's family and how can we work with that. So if rice is, or pasta, or a very high carb food is very traditional, we can talk about portions of those and trying to manage how to include them. We can also talk about alternatives. And the beauty of the current nutrition landscape is that there actually are quite a few alternatives out there. So if you have even noticed that Chipotle started offering cauliflower rice, that is an option to. You don't even have to go completely to a low carb option. So I guess my point is you don't have to say, I'm never eating rice and it has to be cauliflower rice, which by the way is just chopped up cauliflower and seasoned and flavored. But you could even do half regular rice and half cauliflower rice. And I think people forget that they could do that and maybe cut the carbs a little bit, but still include some of their favorite foods. So there are many ways to approach that. But as a dietitian nutritionist, I find that is incredibly important to make sure we include and talk about culturally appropriate foods. I kind of like to call these with my clients the non-negotiables. So when you talk about, what's your non-negotiable? What do you have to have in your life, or it just isn't going to work? Because if you don't talk about that and acknowledge those non-negotiables, I'm going to tell you mine. It's typically dark chocolate and wine. If you told me I couldn't have those things, I would run away and I would never come back. So I always make sure we talk about how to include the non-negotiables in any type of nutrition plan.
Eating healthy is expensive, and when I consulted someone for healthy eating behaviors, they showed me foods that I just never heard before or never prepared before. I mean, I think I was even handed an article of 50 different ways to make chia seeds fun. I don't know. I'm not really a big fan of those. And how can someone who has maybe a picky appetite or a picky palate and maybe on a budget, like what kind of recommendations could you offer?
So that's a great question. It's very individualized, in my opinion. I think what we need, how I would approach that with a client is I would be looking at where does somebody grocery shop and what do they have access to. Interestingly enough, while I know you don't love chia seeds, you actually can find some of these types of products at Walmart and Aldi. But if you are not somebody who knows what a chia seed is or has any interest in eating it, then that's probably not the approach I should take with this person. So we got to start with where we are, and I think that's the most important thing. Is what let's see where we can find those quick wins. You know, what is this person like and eating that might already be a healthy choice, and how can we capitalize on that? Maybe find new ways to cook that or incorporate it more into someone's eating plan. So for a good example might be back to that rice cauliflower. If someone does like cauliflower, it can serve as a replacement in casserole dishes. So if you normally have a chicken and rice casserole, you could potentially put the like chopped up cauliflower instead of rice. So I will be honest, buying the cauliflower rice already chopped for you is expensive, but there's no reason that you couldn't buy cauliflower and chop it yourself too. So there are ways to kind of get around some of those cost issues, but they usually are a little bit more time consuming, and that's real. And I very much acknowledge that as a potential barrier, but we work through those. So we look for those wins and kind of individualize it based on the person.
For a family that might have a whole bunch of different picky eaters in them, did you find, or is there a recipe that you kind of come across that you kind of share and it tends to always be a favorite for the family?
I do have one. Full disclosure, I typically specialize in lower carbohydrate nutrition, often because I am working with people with diabetes. So I have a favorite recipe that is from delish.com that is called cauliflower baked ziti. It is kind of like a pasta dish, and it has all these really yummy pasta flavors, but it doesn't have any pasta in it. And I have given this recipe to lots of patients and clients, and it always gets rave reviews. I had a woman tell me that she was going to be making it every single week for her family. So when people ask me for some of my favorite recipes, that's one that I always share. And that may be because I grew up in a house that often had spaghetti and meatballs as one of our favorite dinners. So I tend to kind of lean towards that. How can I make my comfort food of Italian foods? Certainly, I have many others, but that's a favorite of mine. And we will link to that in the description.
How do you think you're doing?
I hope it's okay.
Yeah, I think you're doing good.
I'm having fun.
Thank you so much, Dawn. That was amazing, and I hope to continue this conversation because there's so much we could talk about with diabetes and healthy eating. But we were able to cover quality carbs, cultural preferences, meal planning strategies for the family, and really, I hope that we can continue this conversation. If you guys are interested in reaching out to Dawn, check the description below. I'll put her contact information for everyone to check her out. And also, if you guys enjoy this video, maybe consider commenting, tell us what you think, subscribing, liking, and that's it. That's all I have. So until next time, take care. I think my dog's barking.